Welcome back. We kind of wrapped up, I guess you could say, the first component of chapter 8. We talked about what we'd learned in chapters 5, 6, and 7, talking about inflation, talking about GDP, or the economy and the growth in the economy, talking about unemployment, how those impacts, trying to bring them together to see what actually or how they drive the economy. So what we're going to talk about now is just aggregate demand. And some people get a little confused in aggregate demand, and especially in the economy, when you're talking about aggregate demand, they get confused between aggregate demand in the economy and the demand curve for a individual market. And we'll get into that in a few minutes about what the differences are. But aggregate demand is basically saying it's a quantity of output that consumers are willing and able to purchase at a given price. And when we say the economy of output in aggregate demand, we're talking about the economy as a whole. We're not talking about a pound of hamburger. We're not talking about a bottle of wine. We're not talking about a 5-pound bag of potatoes or a 10-pound bag of flour. Those are more individual markets, and talking about demand in individual markets and quantity demanded as you slide up and down that demand curve. What we're talking about now is aggregate demand of the economy. And aggregate demand of the economy, the same components drive the aggregate demand of, for the economy as do the nominal GDP, or even the real GDP, depending on which one you're playing around with. So you've got consumption, you've got investment, and investment's going to be either residential stock. So individuals, as we talked about in one of the earlier chapters, individuals buying new homes, new houses. You're talking about capital stock, and capital stock is the coffee maker at Starbucks, the microwave that they have to do your sandwiches. It's at Meharry. We're talking about radiology equipment. We're talking about laboratory equipment. We're talking about X-ray machines, beds, building. Those are capital stocks. And when we talk about, again, investment, whether we're talking about GDP or we're talking about aggregate demand, we're not thinking in terms of, at least at this given point in time, we're not so much thinking in terms of financial capital. We're thinking more of capital stock and residential stock. And then you've also got government purchases, which good old Uncle Sam's going to, purchase, some things throughout the year. And, they have a budget that they pass, theoretically from time to time. And that budget is used to generate capital or generate government purchases. That's the third component of the aggregate demand curve. And then the last one is the net exports. It's the foreign markets. It's, what are the prices of our goods and services look like compared to prices of goods and services that they have or can produce in their individual markets? Or better yet, what's our comparative advantage? Do we have a comparative advantage that's going to hold the price of goods and services at a level that is very appealing to a foreign country? So those are what we're looking at, the four components. Those are things that are going to drive this aggregate demand. And what we want to think about is the aggregate demand curve it's similar to the market demand curve. It's a graphical representation of these four factors, the four components that are driving the aggregate demand of a given economy. Also, when we're looking at aggregate demand, you're actually, it's a typical curve or graphical representation. On the y-axis, we're talking about, price levels. Might be talking about CPI, might be talking about PCE, might be talking about, in most cases, it's the implicit price deflator that we're talking about when we're talking about price levels and we're drawing the graph. And then on the x-axis or the horizontal part of the graph, we're talking about real GDP. And remember, if you go back to the chapter 5, I think it was on GDP, we're talking about, the implicit price deflator is equal to nominal GDP divided by real GDP multiplied by 100. Or if you do a little math magic that a lot of professors like to do when they get up on the, if they're drawing this stuff out on the blackboard, they're rearranging terms and, like magic. Now you have the real GDP is equal to normal GDP divided by the implicit price deflator. So depending on how you want to calculate, how you want to look at it, that's what's going to be plotted on that horizontal curve. And then on the vertical curve, you're going to have the price level. And if you think back to it, it's a downward sloping demand curve. But if you think back to the individual markets, and here's where the differences occur. If you're looking at an individual market, that demand curve is downward sloping for a particular good or service. And remember, you're talking about price level on the vertical, you're talking or individual price on the vertical, and you're talking about the quantity demanded on the horizontal. And so what you have on that downward sloping demand curve for an individual market, you've got two things going on. You've got a substitution effect. And so let's say we're talking about, well, we're plotting, chicken, a pound of chicken. And so the substitution effect, as that curve is downward sloping, the lower the price, more and more people are going to buy or purchase chicken to go into their meal plans for a given day. And as they're buying more and more chicken at lower and lower prices, it's actually that substitution effect. Now you see people maybe moving away from pork, maybe they're moving away from beef because it's higher priced. They're moving away from, or maybe lamb, or maybe seafood, depending on what they're using as they plan their menus. And they're moving to chicken because it's at a lower price. And again, now you're getting that substitution effect on that market demand curves that's going down. The second thing you're getting is you're getting an income effect, because as they can take and substitute a lower expenditure for chicken and get maybe not the same amount of protein, but a similar amount of protein, it can combine and with other ingredients to generate a meal plan that they find acceptable. Then they have more money to spend on other things, going to the movie, buying a Starbucks coffee, upgrading their car, some other, and it's an income effect, and that's what helps drive that down. So that's what you're finding on the individual market, where it's there is a substitution effect and there's an income effect, but you don't have that when it comes to the aggregate demand curve. It is downward sloping, true enough, but you don't have that income effect and you don't have the substitution effect. Because if you're looking at the aggregate demand curve, there is a change in the overall prices. It's not the change in one price compared to another, or the change in pork, the change in the price of pork relative to the change in the price of, the change in the price of chicken relative to the change in the price of pork or beef or seafood. You're looking at the aggregate demand curve, and it is the overall price impact for the economy. And so there's no really relative price change that's impacting it. And the second thing is, when you're looking at the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve, you are looking at a situation where there is no income effect, because there's changes across the relative prices. And so you've got, in this economy, you've got buyers over here and you've got sellers over here. They're being brought together in the market and they're exchanging goods and services for prices. So buyers and sellers, expenditures, incomes, and so everything, it balances itself out. So there is no change in relative prices, and there's no change in no income effect in the aggregate demand. And then you talk about the book. If you kind of went through the text, at least I hope you read the text, they talk about why is the slope downward. And one thing to kind of keep in mind is, if you remember, if you go back to maybe it was the inflation chapter, we talked about the equation of exchange. And we said, the equation of exchange was on the left-hand side of that. If I'm looking at you on the left-hand side of the equation, it's money and the velocity. And on the right-hand side, it's price and output. So, and if you remember, we kind of distill that down, and we said at the end of the day, the easiest thing to do is, rather than having to multiply and divide, is look at the percent change. So you've got the percent change in money plus the percent change. And when I say money, the quantity of money, plus the percent change in the velocity, how quickly it turns over. And that equates to the percent change in price level and the percent change in output. So if you've got an equation set up at this point, two variables on this side equates to two variables on this side. If you know any of those three variables, you can always calculate the fourth one. So just keep that in mind as we go through this next 3 or 4 sections on where we're talking about aggregate supply and aggregate demand, because that's going to be helpful as you kind of think through and process what's going on. So when we talk about the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve, first thing the text talks about is it's the wealth effect. And as price level drops, the real value of wealth goes up. So, and when I say real value of wealth, it's savings, it's IRAs, it's 401k, it's houses you own, it's assets you own. So, talking about, and here we're talking about real wealth, we're talking about stocks and bonds and, money market accounts. And so you're looking at real wealth, and people feel wealthier. And as they start to feel wealthier, they tend to consume more. They not only can, tend to consume more in the long run, they tend to consume more in the short run. And as long as some level of wealth is stored, more purchasing power at different price levels. So as long as you've got some wealth, and as long as you've got price levels coming down, you're going to feel wealthier and you're going to spend more money. I mean, that's just human nature. The second one, and so to kind of summarize that one, as price levels fall, purchasing power of wealth goes up and consumer spending goes up. And if you reverse it, price levels go up, purchasing power of wealth goes down, consumer spending, what happens to it? It's going to go down too. So here you're looking at, and remember, when we talk about individuals, we have a lot that drives their mentality is the expectations, the information they have driving expectations of not only the current process, but expectations of the future. So that's what happens as price levels and the impact in wealth, and that's why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. The second thing to talk about is interest rates. And again, we're talking about interest rates here. We're talking about capital stock. We're talking about residential stock. And as the tendency is for as price levels go up, the quantity of money goes up and the interest rates go up. So as interest rates go up, what happens? The individual in, say, the local construction company, let's say, as interest rates go up, it makes it more difficult for that individual. So, local construction contractor, maybe they're thinking about buying a new dump truck, maybe they're thinking about buying a new crane or a new, bulldozer or something. And as those prices tend to go up, then the quantity of money starts to go up and the interest rate goes up, and they start to think, well, their expectation, now they're starting to get nervous. They don't know what the future is going to look like. And so what they tend to do is they tend to make their buying decisions based on what they perceive the price level to be at any given time. So price levels going up, they say, well, price level may come down, so I'm going to delay this big purchase maybe for 6 months just to see if this thing levels out. And it's the same thing with home buyers. Kind of in a weird market right now, because as interest rates are higher, especially mortgage interest rates, there's still a lot of people out there trying to buy new homes, or trying to, especially in the resale market, but also trying to buy new homes. And as typically, though, as interest rates are going up, especially mortgage rates, you have people stepping back and they're starting to think, well, maybe, I was thinking about selling my house and buying a new house. Maybe I'm just going to stay in this house for a while, maybe for the next 6 months or a year, just to see how the market does. So now you've got, it's impacting, the wealth effect, it's impacting the interest rate effect. And then let's look at the international trade deficit. What's it going to do to net exports? And so a tendency for a change in price level to affect net exports. As price levels drop, the demand for exports go up and the demand for imports go down. So you've got as price level drops, you've got individuals in the within the nation's domestic economy, whether it's United States, whether it's Great Britain, whether it's France, they say, well, hey, prices are dropping. I'm going to start buying more things domestically. That microwave I was looking at, I'm going to start buying it domestically. It's made in the United States. I'm going to buy it domestically here rather than buying an import. So, or just some type of an imported microwave is coming in, because at that point it's more expensive. So you've got an increase in the domestic purchasing, but you've also got an increase in the demand for exports, because now people are looking at people in France or Germany or Africa or China. They're looking at what we can make through some type of competitive advantage. We can make it cheaper, so it's cheaper in the United States. So they're going to start buying our exports, and it's going to impact the relationship. Remember, net exports, it's exports minus imports. So as exports go up, imports go down, net exports are going to go up. So now you've had a wealth effect and its impact on consumption. You've had investment effect, and that's what happens, with the impact on the interest rates. Now we're talking about international trade, and that's what it's going to impact on when it comes to the net exports. And then finally, you've got, good old Uncle Sam sitting in there. And, what's Uncle Sam going to do? Uncle Sam, depending on what the budget is, and there may be things that Uncle Sam is going to implement that if, depending on whether that price level is going up or that price level is going down, they may decide they're either going to postpone some of their government purchases, whether it's, for the military, whether it's infrastructure, building bridges or, improving roads. They're going to make their decisions at that point based on what they think the price level is going to do. So same thing with the government, depending on whether that price level is going up or that price level is going down, it's going to impact the government purchases. And that's actually going to determine, what the impact is on the aggregate demand. So again, think about GDP, think about how, that expenditure model for GDP was calculated. You've got consumption, you've got investment, you've got government purchases, you've got net exports, and changes in the aggregate demand of goods and services demanded. It's more or less at any given price level along the demand curve. So, we're talking about, again, at any change in price level, holding all other determinants of aggregate demand unchanged causes movements along that aggregate demand curve. So similar concept to the market demand. It's just how do we get to that downward slope of that aggregate demand curve? So again, any good macroeconomist is going to be like any other economist. They're going to start making models and developing models and building, hypotheses, and, hopefully they end up with just theories and laws. But at the end of the day, we are trying to simplify the impact of this extremely complex economy and extremely complex market. And we're going to say, ceteris paribus, we're going to hold this thing. We're going to try to hold this thing unchanged, and we're going to study kind of one piece at the time. So that's kind of the overview, the high level overview of aggregate demand. It kind of gives you a flavor of why that thing is sloping downward. And then in the next segment or the next component, we're going to talk for a few minutes about, changes in aggregate demand, what's driving these changes, how we may get into, not sure on this next component, but somewhere down through this chapter, we're going to start talking about, what can the experts in DC do to drive policy to try to ensure that, again, at the end of the day, we're trying to keep that economy humming along and trying to keep it moving forward. And we're trying to, again, maximize the benefit of the overall well-being of the nation's population. And in our case, in the nation, the nation's population here in the United States. So that's going to kind of wrap up this piece for right now. We're going to get into the third section or third component in a few minutes, and I'll talk to everybody then. Thank you.